Welcome, Adam's Child, to this long-coming sermon that examines pre-war America's most widespread religion, Christianity. For the purposes of this video, I am solely focusing on Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox churches and the myriad of offshoots and branches under their umbrellas. Mormons, otherwise known as Latter-day Saints, will be examined in a separate video and won't be discussed here. Let's crank up the rads to make things a little comfortable in here as we explore what Christianity was like before the bombs, how Christianity coped with the Great War, and what Christianity looked like after the dust settled, including all the strange and often dangerous post-war cults and religions that sprang up. Much like our world, Fallout's world before bombs and missiles blessed us all with Adam's holy glow appears to have had a dominant religion, Christianity. Among the twisted ruins and burned out remains of pre-war America, a number of churches survived. In fact, the only pre-war buildings of worship that we find are Christian, which speaks to its continued prevalence in the late 2070s. What was Christianity like, though, on the eve of the world's atomic baptism? There are signs of scamming conmen, tragedy, struggle, and at times miraculous victory, as well as such relatable things as TV evangelists, missionary work, and good old American tradition, so it may not feel that weird after all. Just like in our world, many churches and church organizations lived or died based on the generous donations of its faithful members. There are some examples of churches and church schools that struggled to remain afloat. Some were successful while others were not. Whether this is due to a decrease in religious attendance and affiliation, or a result of the harder economic times pre-war America found itself in, isn't clear. A school in Boston, which became known as the East Boston Preparatory School, was founded by the Catholic Church, and in the years before the Great War was forced to cease operations when its funding dried up. A close sister school, DB Technical High School, was another Catholic-funded school that appears to have been doing just fine, though. A Catholic cathedral in Pittsburgh that would become known as the Sanctum in the post-war would also run into financial trouble. This is all the more shocking since a note can be found listing the top donors for the month prior to the Great War, which totaled an incredible $2,700,000. Which is only from the top 10 donors. There were undoubtedly more donors that didn't even crack the top 10 list. That is a lot of money. But the cathedral was a large building with several clergymen, and once Fallout's high inflation is factored in, perhaps it really wasn't quite enough. At any rate, donations were apparently down across the board, and everyone was expected to try and raise at least $155,000 for October. This would push one priest to try and get donations from some sort of criminal group. How or why this transpired is not known, but this group promised the priest the world and then left him with nothing. This situation was extremely distressing to the priest, who felt like he had no other option than to reach out to his fellows in the church, where he emphatically insisted that, quote, "I didn't join the priesthood for money, I just wanted to spread the good word." Well, good news, Brother Michael. October's funding endeavors have been canceled because, the world blew up. It exploded. We've got problems now no amount of worthless dollars can solve. Some churches were anxiously engaged in evangelizing and calling for repentance, even adopting new technology to spread the good word. In the hills of Appalachia, a special iBot was given the mission to call people to repentance and was even given the name Preacher Levinson. Giving a robot a religious title is definitely an interesting development in Fallout's technologically advanced world, and Preacher Levinson's message was one of warning. It roamed the streets, roads, and paths to extort everyone within earshot to repent or be condemned to hell. Playing into the ever-present fear of nuclear annihilation, the iBot asks whether or not people's souls are prepared, and if their seat in heaven is secure. Preacher Levinson was commissioned by the Haven Church in the east side of the map, and this church appears to be Protestant, as there is emphasis on evangelism and being reborn. We also get a glimpse into differences in their doctrine, which could be reflective of mainstream Christianity within Fallout. The preacher very frequently ties communism and the Reds into iniquity and damnation, although they are sure to be clear that even the sin of communism can be forgiven. That's great news. I'll be sure to tell RadKing that he can still be saved. Given how pervasive anti-communist sentiment was in pre-war America, I think it is very likely this was not isolated to this one church. In Fallout Tactics, the Calculator is the endgame enemy, which was an AI that used a series of human brains for processing power. One of the brains was from a pre-war TV evangelist who has a few lines promising people salvation through Jesus and a place in heaven if they send a pledge to his phone number. And he reminds everyone that it ain't cheap. When the brain is attacked, which is necessary to advance the story, it will quote the real-world televangelist Jimmy Swaggart, who was caught in a scandal with a prostitute by claiming, "I did not touch that prostitute." So it seems televangelism was still being practiced, and there was no shortage of controversy with such prominent figures. Some cartoons produced in conjunction with the Fallout TV show depict a variety of pre-war people, with one being an old lady, and she is the only one depicted with Christian iconography in her home, which may hint that the older generations were more religious, similar to our world. Also similar, it appears that Christianity is strongly represented among Republicans, as the cannibal families in Fallout 3 loudly proclaim that they are perfectly happy, good Christian people, and that it's every American's civic duty to vote for their favorite Republican candidate. They are also quick to quote Matthew 7:1 when you discover their horrific man-eating secret by saying, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." Judge all you want, I'm not the one eating people. There were, however, some very dark and disturbing things happening within some Christian churches. These events seem endemic to Appalachia, with the most prominent one taking place at the Kanawha Cemetery and Church. We don't know who or what led to the grisly scene that we can see in-game, but a large group of people who are now only skeletons lie scattered about the chapel with cups beside them. It becomes clear how they died when inspecting the area around the podium. Rat poison has been mixed with some sort of drink, possibly wine, and everyone partook, leaving everything and everyone behind. This event is very reminiscent of the real-world Jonestown massacre, where dozens of people did precisely this at the direction of their cult leader, Jim Jones. We are left to wonder then, if those passed in the Kanawha Chapel were in a similar situation, following a cultic leader with only loose affiliation with Christianity, or if this was something else entirely. Did this group commit this great tragedy as the bombs were dropping and the Great War commenced? Or was it afterwards as civilization crumbled and everything went to hell? It could happen before the war, but likely not too long before, otherwise you would think it would have been discovered and cleaned up. In Fallout 4's Trinity Church, which is a large Catholic cathedral, a number of skeletons can be found in a foyer with glasses on or nearby them, and yet more in a back room with a bunch of wine. Was this one final goodbye toast to the world as it ended, either through copious amounts of alcohol consumption or another instance of poisoning? The number of times this has happened is really concerning. Should I call somebody? Another church that has become only known as the Sunken Church in Appalachia one day disappeared, all but for the steeple and roof, as an enormous sinkhole swallowed the building whole. It isn't known how many people died when the church sank into the earth, but there is one skeleton that seems to tell a damning story. A man dressed in a suit next to a duffel bag filled with pre-war money, and nearby some offering plates, also with some cash. Nearby are some pastor's vestments that were discarded, and we see a nearby podium with rat poison on an inner shelf. At the very least, it seems an individual, either a priest or someone passing themselves off as a priest, was loading up money and about to get away when the church was swallowed up. Was this some sort of divine justice, or just a really unlucky day for one specific scumbag? We can also gather clues about pre-war Christianity based on the remains of churches and chapels that dot the wasteland, even 2 centuries after the Great War, like we are some sort of irradiated archaeologists. It belongs in a museum. Although the day the bombs fell on October 23, 2077 was a Saturday at 9:42 a.m., which is not traditionally a time for high church attendance. Catholics will hold a daily mass, which includes Saturday. Many other Christian churches hold various events or activities on different days, and even a minority of Christian sects consider Saturday the Sabbath. We do indeed find many interesting things primarily in Fallout 4 and 76. Churches in Fallout 3 and New Vegas seem to be completely devoid of many pre-war details. However, in Fallout 4, it's not uncommon to find a number of skeletons amongst the pews, those that presumably died when the bombs dropped or shortly after. Couples are sitting close to each other, like a soldier and his love, his helmet neatly placed beside him, a family with a baby, the father apparently reaching back to placate the child. And in 3 separate instances, a skeleton draped dramatically over the podium as if they had been giving a sermon, talk, or speech before falling over dead. In one church, we even find a long-destroyed Protectron sitting in the pews. Was this Protectron assisting with church functions? Or, hear me out, was this Protectron attending the sermon? Hard to say, but we can tell that using robots for church and religious functions was seemingly not uncommon. It may just be the natural evolution of things in a world where robots are increasingly prevalent. In nearly every church, we find burned or ruined books near the skeletons or on the podium. And these are more than likely hymnals or scriptures that have been ravaged by time and nuclear destruction. What other kind of books would people be using at a church? It is tricky to know whether what we see left over in these churches is actually from the pre-war, or if they were placed there in the post-war. However, the pulpits that have items on the inner shelf that have a draping skeleton are probably good indicators that the objects are pre-war or pretty close to it. There are some questionable items that can be found in these skeleton-draped pulpits. A 10mm pistol, pre-war cash, and a toy alien are among the more curious objects that can be found stashed away by the priest or pastor. Were these necessary items for the tumultuous pre-war days, or did these church leaders have something else going on? Additionally, just like in the real world, Boston seems to have more Catholic churches than Protestant ones, and both DC and Appalachia seem to be more Protestant overall. Regardless of the state or strength of Christianity in pre-war America, which seems very similar to our world and time, culturally, it was very pervasive. Allusions to Christianity are plentiful. Vault-Tec referenced the story of Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt in their training videos. Those creepy mechanical fortune tellers will read a fortune that is a variation of Matthew 5:5, reading, "Blessed are the children, for they will inherit a scorched earth." A radio play in Fallout 76 has one character refer to another as Judas when they begin to plot someone's death, and this cultural influence wouldn't be completely stomped out by the bombs. That fateful day, though, was earth-shattering, steel-rending, and a tremendous test of the human spirit and of faith, something that multiple Great War survivors have made a record of. So, what did Christians think of the Day of Days, and how did they cope with the end of the old world? Did they think it just another test? The actual end of the world? The rapture and second coming of Christ? The answer is yes, all of it, to varying degrees. Ava Rose was an elderly, faithful Christian woman in the pre-war who was unfortunate enough to live in Pittsburgh. Nah, I'm just kidding, yins. The unfortunate part is that she lived in Pittsburgh when the bombs dropped, which became a living hellscape when the destruction, radiation, and industrial pollution combined into a rancorous brew of misery and death. Ava's strong faith has been with her since she was young, as she was born with spinal issues that made walking extremely difficult. She would experience a miracle on her 7th birthday when she was suddenly able to get up out of her bed, where she spent a majority of her life, and was able to walk by herself. Like everyone else, she witnessed traumatic death and destruction when the bombs dropped, as she saw a man right in front of her get hit by the heat wave from an atomic blast and instantly blister and die. Not knowing what to do, she curled up on the ground and somehow escaped any serious injury amongst the rubble. The second great miracle of her life. The absolute destruction and savagery that resulted from the bombs is enough for her to consider the pit a literal hell on earth, and their trials and tribulations are all some sort of test from God. These tests would only get more difficult as Ava, like many other survivors, would seek refuge from the destruction at a cathedral that survived the bombs that would be called the Sanctum. The Sanctum was isolated from the rest of the pit, which Pittsburgh became known as, accessible only through tunnels, and people started to gather there as it was considered one of the safest places in the ruins. This place of safety didn't last for long though, as the pit's most unhinged and violent raiders called the Fanatics would find out about the Sanctum and immediately seize both the building and everyone within it, enslaving them all except for one. Through yet another great miracle, Ava was somehow able to escape enslavement by these fanatics, which she attributes to guidance from the Holy Spirit, as she believes she was spared for a special purpose. She found that purpose in helping the main group fighting the fanatics known as the Pittsburgh Union by collecting the tracking slave collars of all those that were killed by the fanatics, learning their names, and officially laying them to rest. She believes this is her ultimate purpose and why she has been preserved despite everything, including her advanced age. But funny enough, she does not regard these incredible healings and unexplainable survivals as miraculous. They are all just part of God's plan. Even with how bleak life is in the pit, with bloodthirsty trogs, insane radiation, industrial pollution, and literally crazy raiders, Ava maintains her faith with purpose. Somehow, even amid horrific slavery and abuse, she holds some compassion for the fanatics, thinking ultimately they are suffering on the inside and only continue their evil ways because they consider themselves beyond salvation and therefore continue to dig themselves deeper into perdition. This is because deep down she believes in the Christian doctrine that all people are God's children, and therefore she thinks all some people need is a helping hand or someone to believe in them. She thinks that ultimately, should she and those around her endure the test of the pit and bring God's light to others, that they will have a place in His kingdom. Ava is an incredible example of faith and perseverance in the face of extreme adversity, but she is perhaps the only overtly optimistic example that we know of, and therefore likely represents a smaller proportion of Christians that were forced to endure the calamity of the Great War. In Appalachia, an individual we only known as the letter R, which he used to sign off a series of letters, appears to have been a priest in the pre-war city of Charleston, West Virginia. In a series of short notes, he speaks of life in the pre-war, as well as the post-war period. He waxed poetic about a local coffee shop that let people connect with friends and familiar faces, and a therapist who helped those in the city by being a listening ear for those that really needed to talk. R was quite hopeful in the wake of the bombs because the people of Charleston pulled together and began to rebuild, and it was through this unity and perseverance that R had hope for the future and saw good in the world. Even as he witnessed atrocities like a man being murdered for his own home by a sniper, R would hold out hope. This hope was shattered though when on Christmas Day 2082, normally a day of tradition, family, and remembrance of the birth of Jesus, a raider leader burst the Summersville Dam with several mini nukes, leading to thousands of tons of water to smash the remains of Charleston. Buildings were destroyed, homes were washed away and filled with sediment, and thousands of people perished in the flood. But somehow, R survived. With one single action, R saw the good in the world washed away and the hopes of a better world destroyed. One of his final actions before he disappeared and stopped leaving notes was to visit the First Friends Church in Charleston, and in a coffin, lay pastor's vestments with his final note. The note reads, "These are not mine, not anymore. Perhaps they will give you the comfort that I have lost." Although he held out hope even after being subject to the horrors of the apocalypse, R lost all of that on Christmas Day, and the interment of his vestments in a coffin at the Charleston church was a physical manifestation of his loss of faith and hope, but he is far from alone. Another man born and raised in the town of Flatwoods in Appalachia spent time fighting for God and country after joining the military before settling down and becoming a reverend in his hometown. Delbert Winters was happy with his life in Flatwoods, helping and guiding the faithful of his church. That is, until the bombs fell. Winters experienced what he would later call the wrath, and as missiles and bombs began to rain down, he believed the lights he saw in the sky was actually the second coming of Christ. When the earth fell still and the last bombs had been dropped, both he and his congregation remained, rather than being caught up in the rapture he believed would occur as part of the second coming. It was then that it became clear that the lights in the sky and the cataclysms were not due to the second coming, but something else entirely. As the world around him began to fall apart, Winters began double-guessing everything. Were these tribulations the result of him not being charitable enough? Was he being punished for having wicked thoughts? Or had he simply not praised God's name enough and now he was doomed to a destroyed world? Winters prays now more than ever, but he doesn't seem to get any answers or hear much of anything at all. Had he actually heard answers before, or was it all just in his mind? Winters was at a crisis of faith, terrified that what may have actually cursed him to endure this was the fighting and killing he did as a soldier. But how could he ever apologize and find forgiveness for such things? It was at this point, in the depths of despair, that Winters came across a ragged group of survivors who were clinging to life by eating raw rat meat behind some dumpsters. Winters felt sorry for them, admonishing them to cook any meat before eating it to stave off an illness, when, with a sudden realization, he knew his purpose. Winters was a good cook and he enjoyed it too, and he began cooking for any survivors, adapting his recipes to whatever ingredients he could scavenge in the post-war world. This new purpose, helping survivors eat healthy food, boosted his spirits, but he was still unsure of his beliefs, namely, whether life after death was true or not. Winters' kindness and charity for those most desperate caught the attention of Appalachia's largest faction of survivors called the Responders, who were dedicated to the rebuilding of society that had crumbled to dust. He agreed with their cause and readily joined them, cooking more than ever before, running a book club, and even hosting a nightly survivors' guilt meeting. Winters continued to make sense of his situation in the lens of his faith, remarking on all the interesting mutations the plants and animals were undergoing, thinking that the post-war world was like the post-flood world of the Bible, and he was sure that even some of the more bizarre things that he saw, like two-headed cows, were not a mistake, but simply God being creative. Of course, the success of Full Bellies and healing were seen by local raider groups who wanted a slice of that pie and would mount regular attacks, which strengthened Winters' resolve in protecting his survivors. Winters would die though, as a devastating plague called the Scorched Plague would rip through Appalachia, as most people were faced with the choice of fleeing before the plague and the scorched beasts, or standing their ground and dying. Winters' body is one of many that lie in Appalachia, and one of many that did not get any confirmed closure. He died doing what he thought was right, preparing himself and those around him for when God would return, but continued to doubt whether he was doing enough, and disheartened to be met with continued silence with his prayers. It is interesting to note that nowhere does Winters mention proselyting or leading religious services in the post-war. The closest he appears to have gotten is when he was assigned by the Responders as the morale officer, which included preaching morale. But notably, he is not referred to as a reverend or religious leader. There is another dead responder in the second floor of the church in pastor's vestments, so perhaps that individual was the spiritual leader, while Winters wasn't because of uncertainty in his faith. Winters was killed by a disillusioned responder, and it's not clear if she was the one who stabbed the book next to Winters' body, but that image right there seems to be making a statement. That said, he maintained his vestments, and indeed his body can be found clad in pastor's clothing, and even if he did not truly reconcile his faith and his lived experience, he would form a sort of legacy with all his new recipes that would spread through Appalachia, providing nutrition to all those who would come after him. Perhaps one of the more unexpected turnarounds of a once devout Christian comes in the form of Caleb Fisher. Caleb grew up Amish, living his pre-war life within his community, many of which apparently survived the fiery deluge of the Great War. Also, many within his community would use their survival as proof that they were on God's true path as opposed to other differing Christian sects. But Caleb, he disagreed. The Great War had shaken the foundations of the faith that he had grown up with, and disagreements with his community grew to the point that he used the tradition of Rumspringa when he was a teenager to leave his community and his lifelong faith for good. The savage post-war world made Caleb realize a few things. He viewed faith as a weakness in the wasteland, prayer as useless, and that if you wanted to survive, there was absolutely no room for turning the other cheek. He dropped his faith in God and put it instead into hard work and loyalty instead, believing that faith is a tool with many uses, but when used incorrectly, it blinds people to the truth. Caleb became a raider, joining the group of raiders that coalesced around the crater, a crashed space station, when the scorched plague threat was neutralized by the Vault 76 dwellers. That is a pretty massive 180 from being in such an insular religious group to becoming a raider, the scourge of the wastes. Still though, years of being brought up in his Amish community gave him mannerisms that he holds to this day, invoking the name of God in his everyday speech, even if he says he no longer believes in him. Still, some would take comfort in the words of the Bible and their faith, like Dontrell Haynes, who was the last survivor at the Morgantown Airport in Appalachia. Having lost his brother, his friends, and even contracting cancer from residual radiation, he was able to make peace with his loss and his fate due to his faith. We can see then that people made sense of the greatest tragedy to befall man in different ways. For some, it strengthened their faith. For most, it was an arduous trial of their faith that didn't necessarily end with them ever coming back, while some seemed to find solace even in the most fatal of circumstances. And even some forsook everything to survive, raiding and pillaging the innocent. The churches that survived the Great War and that once echoed with songs of worship, sermons, and sacrament would in most cases take on completely new and vastly different roles, most of which were not religious. Many churches would be abandoned, empty, or holding the remains of those that attended so long ago, falling apart due to neglect. Still, a number of others would be recognized as large defensible structures, and even centuries after the Great War would be claimed by raiders and super mutants as bases from which they could launch attacks and hold hostages. On the West Coast, just outside of New Vegas, are the only two churches in the whole game at the NCR-held former city of Searchlight. The churches have not been restored as places of worship, rather becoming useful areas for storage. Still others, especially in Fallout 4 and 76, had an unnatural attraction for ghouls, where the ghouls gather and remain in the graveyards just adjacent to many churches or within the church itself. In the absence of nuclear material, of which sometimes there is some, what could be attracting ghouls specifically to graveyards and churches? Churches would also commonly become places of sanctuary and eventually fighting, as evidenced by some with overturned pews as makeshift defensive positions, weapons, ammo, and even the remains of those that died in that defense. One very notable thing, however, is the complete lack of crosses or other Christian iconography across nearly all games at every location. An out-of-universe explanation could be Bethesda wanting to sidestep any controversy by showing overtly religious symbols from any religion. Although, one sneaky little cross adorns the cover of the so-called scripture that one can obtain from Daniel, a Mormon missionary, in New Vegas' Honest Hearts DLC. Daniel and his Mormon counterpart Joshua can both be seen reading from that very book of scripture in idle animations. A good in-universe explanation is hard to come by. It is extremely unlikely that the universal symbol of Christianity, the cross, was dropped by everyone, everywhere. It is also unlikely that such imagery was removed or destroyed after the war. That would be a lot of work when your time is best spent gathering resources and fighting off looters and raiders. The last option is a suppression of such imagery by the government itself, although we have zero evidence of such top-down persecution in the Fallout world, so I would like to hear some of your thoughts and theories. As far as we can tell, large factions have been more interested in using churches as medical facilities or bases for operations rather than setting them aside for their pre-war religious purposes. The responders in Fallout 76 co-opted the church at Point Pleasant, using it as a medical center and a hospital, the Helvetia Church and the Flatwoods Church as a multi-purpose building as well. Another group called the Appalachian Free States was an anti-government militia group that also turned the church at the town of Harper's Ferry into a base with storage, beds, workbenches, desks, and sofas. Depending on the layout of the church, churches could actually make very defensible positions with only one or two ways in. Designs that are made of stone and layouts with smaller and elevated windows could make good places to dig in. And indeed, we see the Free Staters did just that by fortifying the entrance to the church that they claimed. The Quincy Church in Fallout 4 was reused by post-war survivors as a multi-purpose building, mainly consisting of workstations and shelving, and the pre-war church located in the east side of the den in Fallout 2 is used by the powerful slave guild leader Metzger to store chemicals. It appears large factions do not resume Christian worship in old churches and cathedrals, often rather using them for something they deem more useful. In Fallout 4, a small church called the Lonely Chapel is not that interesting, except that there is an entrance to the federal ration stockpile, an important and secure location that was guarded by the military to hand out and keep track of rations during the pre-war. This was definitely a known passage, since we can inspect the church and find dead soldiers that had assumed control of the chapel and dead civilians just outside. Were these soldiers told to guard this entrance to the stockpile at all costs, even if that meant shooting and killing their fellow Americans? Would normal civilians even know about this? Or were they just coming to the church for safety or comfort? Whatever the case, it seems the soldiers died at their posts and the chapel laid empty ever since. We already touched on how churches became places for post-war survivors to congregate and get help. The Sanctum in the Pit was one such place before it was overrun. We get another good example of churches becoming post-war havens for survivors, but this has a strange ending. Haven Church was a large and successful church in the pre-war that is located in the Meyer region of Fallout 76's map, with a chapel, an office, and a classroom. This was the very same church that commissioned the Ibot, Preacher Levinson, to roam around and preach repentance. When the Great War occurred, large groups of people gathered at the church, which did have some stored supplies, but so many people needed help that the store of supplies ran out after only a few weeks. A note that can be found at the pulpit in the chapel was a prayer written by either one of the gathered faithful or the church's pastor, and is a plea during dark times. It asks for strength, tolerance, knowledge, and confidence to know how to live like this, to know how to wait for God, for the ability to help others to survive this test, and it ends strangely by saying, "The test you promised would never happen again." It isn't clear what is meant by this last statement. Perhaps it is referencing God's promise to never flood the world again, and this fiery deluge was seen as a similar catastrophe, a flood of fire, if you will. Eventually, it was clear that unless something was done to secure more supplies, everyone would suffer from hunger and illness. We don't know what became of the search party, because something even worse befell the survivors. The church was noticed and scouted out by a raider group, who figured that with so many people taking shelter there, that they must have a good number of supplies. The raiders attacked, and while the survivors put up a valiant defense, barricading the doors and using what limited weapons they had, they were no match. Those not killed in the defense were hastily executed and their bodies thrown behind the church, while the raiders claimed the church as their base. One night, the raider leader named Skig woke up in the middle of the night and he could hear something. Some weird music, as he said, but he couldn't find a source at all. At first, only Skig could hear it, and most of his crew just thought he was drunk, but then others started to hear the music as well, occurring only at night. It wasn't just any random music, it was organ music, presumably from the church's very own organ. The music was creepy enough, but when burned and rot-smelling crazy people swarmed the church one night, Skig decided that the survivors that they had massacred were sending them a message, and he was going to get the hell out of Dodge. This attack was, of course, a horde of ghouls, but apparently this was the first time these raiders had ever encountered them, and although they killed all the attacking ghouls, all but one raider would leave for good, and that one that decided to stick around would eventually be killed by ghouls that now occupy the church. Were the ghouls attracted to the church by the pile of rotting corpses? Were they attracted to the church because of some supernatural attraction? There is absolutely something bringing ghouls to churches and graveyards in this post-war period, but what exactly it is isn't clear. Not all churches became overcrowded sanctuaries, or turned into bases though. At least a few tried to carry on their intended mission. The most interesting example of this was in Appalachia in the town of Sutton. The church stands empty 25 years after the Great War, but when entering, the eye is first drawn to a massive sign that says, "Repent," at the end of the church, a very unique addition we haven't seen anywhere else. And along the floor are many skeletons. So what happened here? Just after the war, believers were still meeting at and worshiping at their local church, but somehow they were fooled into following not a Jesus-loving, compassionate pastor, but rather a raider posing as one. This raider was able to manipulate his followers to do all sorts of things, like giving him their stuff. Getting stuff this way was so much easier than killing and extorting and kidnapping, and the raider wanted to keep this con going. From his journal entries, it is clear he was not well versed in Christian theology, talking about the importance of loyalty, self-actualization, mental barriers, and enlightenment. It appears this became more of a cult than a normal Christian congregation, but when some of his adherents saw him flaunting his wealth in the form of some silken pants, things started going downhill. One of his assistants, Margaret, who he chose specifically because, quote, "Nobody will ditch me for an old lady," started to ask many questions and speak to others in the congregation. The jig was up, and the raider promised his followers that he would step down after his next sermon and leave Margaret to lead them. Nothing is that simple with a raider, because they're not happy unless they get everything. And he had a plan just for that. Some rat poison, some fluids, and the trust of his congregation resulted in the death of every single one of them, even that old hag, Margaret. And the raider was able to get off scot-free with everyone's stuff. He made notes for his next con though. Apparently this method was awfully stinky, so the next group he can get to follow him will need a better method of disposal when the time comes. The bed and furniture at the end of the church implies that he was living here permanently, and how or why he thought he could poison everyone, having them fall down dead in the chapel, and then they wouldn't start rotting and stinking is frankly quite baffling. There are also some defensive structures built in here, but it's hard to know if this was done before or after what has become yet another mass poisoning in a church. Seriously, poisonings happen in churches at an unreal rate in the Fallout universe. Another much smaller church in the town of Clarksburg in Appalachia has a few bodies, the last worshippers to meet here before the scorched plague wiped out nearly everyone. We don't know who they are, but apart from the ghouls, we have some scorched mummies, a dead settler in the pews, and a dead female priest in the pulpit, the only remnants of the last sermon to echo through this church. Finally, we have a very peculiar situation of post-war worship at the Union's Hope Cathedral in Fallout 4. The cathedral has a number of ghouls outside in the adjacent graveyard, and should one enter, even more will crawl out from the debris that has collected inside the church. However, there is one non-feral ghoul occupant of the church that seems to call this place home. Father Gabe is a ghoul that is dressed in priest's vestments, who can be seen praying during idle animation and spending time behind the empty pulpit, bent over a table with candles and a silver platter. We unfortunately don't know why he is here, where he came from, and his personal thoughts on faith, God, and the post-war world, because there are no notes, there is no dialogue, and he will immediately become hostile when he notices you. Fallout 4 strikes again. Is he a pre-war priest that is praying to have his ghoulification cured? Is he actually worshiping and praying to the Christian God, or does he adhere to some post-war faith now? There are only 5 clearly Christian churches shown in the post-war in all the games, encompassing major metropolitan areas, and entire chunks of the country. If we really stretch the definition and include the church in Diamond City in Fallout 4, which we will talk about in a second because it's not that Christian, would make 6 in total, which is very sparse, even given the overall smaller human populations in the post-war. We just covered the only known examples of post-war worship in churches that we know of, and just going by the numbers when comparing how many churches remained as centers of worship and how many became something else entirely, it is very likely that most surviving churches in the wasteland were adapted for new uses rather than continuing to be used as buildings of worship. The breakdown of society and turning of neighbor one on another to stay alive in Fallout's destroyed world had a profound effect on all people of faith, as some completely left it behind, others were left unsure or doubting, while a smaller proportion stayed strong or had their faith grow even stronger. It is no surprise then, given the massive influence pre-war Christianity had on the American populace, and with a breakdown of social norms, new religions began to spring up, many influenced by Christianity, sometimes subtly, and others not so subtly. There are only 2 known churches and groups in the wasteland that seem to be the most similar to pre-war Christianity, the most orthodox of the post-war churches, groups, and religions, if you'll let me say it that way. The first is a small church on an old decaying aircraft carrier in the ruins of Washington, D.C. This old ship is one of the most populous communities in the Capital Wasteland and is known as Rivet City, which has its very own Catholic church called St. Monica's Church. This rather small chapel is very modest, but most rooms are in Rivet City. It's built in and on the remains of a pre-war ship, after all. Interestingly, aside from a bunch of mismatched benches and a podium, nothing else about the chapel even indicates that this is a church. There is no iconography. There are a number of small ruined books laying around, which we may assume are Bibles or hymnals, although it's debatable how useful they would be if they are indeed ruined. It is far removed from what we would expect to see in a Catholic church, and it's not entirely clear where or how the sacrament would be prepared, although we know that the sacrament is indeed administered, although we never see it. There is also a donation box that the player can donate to, or, steal from if you're that kind of person, and donating to the church will give you good karma, making it seem like, hey, there might be something to this. We can definitively call this church Catholic, or at least as Catholic as one can get 200 years after the world was blown to bits, because the Fallout 3 game guide refers to Father Clifford's acolyte, Diego, as specifically being Catholic. And Father Clifford's portrait in the Asia-exclusive Fallout Shelter Online game portrays him as unmistakably Catholic. Like, whoa, that's what all my donation money went to apparently. In addition, the church is associated with Saint Monica, the real-world patron saint of wayward children or broken homes, although Father Clifford and Diego do not wear customary clergy attire. The Good Father can be heard giving the same sermon every Sunday at 8 o'clock, talking about Saint Monica, although he can sometimes be heard saying that he does plan on doing another sermon on one of the 7 deadly sins. Celibacy amongst the clergy seems to still be practiced, since Father Clifford's acolyte Diego must make a choice between marrying Angela Staley, a young woman madly in love with him, or his potential future as the replacement for Father Clifford one day. Depending on how you, the Lone Wanderer, addresses the Diego and Angela situation, Diego can be defrocked and no longer a part of the priesthood if the father is told that Diego and Angela slept together, and Diego can even be threatened with excommunication. This all shows complete or close alignment with traditional Catholic teachings and practices. Father Clifford is also a good example of service and charity, as he is anxiously engaged with a lot of service in Rivet City. He speaks to members of the community that struggle with chem addiction and depression. He stares at you while you sleep. Okay, this is weird. He visits the local infirmary to pray over those that are sick and injured, and he will make his way down to the Muddy Rudder, which is the local pub, to chastise the owners for making it possible for everyone to waste their lives away in alcohol. Father Clifford himself seems to imbibe from time to time, as there's an empty whiskey bottle inside the pulpit, and even a dose of the addictive Med-X Chem. Although, to be fair, that could be just used for pain relief for an old man. But why is it right there in the pulpit? He is apparently so holy, though, that he can just glide around the ground with ease. He is also part of movements and projects much bigger than Rivet City. He believes Project Purity, the main scientific effort to create clean drinking water in the Capital Wasteland, is an endeavor blessed by God and will assist in distributing the clean aqua pura to the locals. He is also a part of the Railroad, a clandestine group that began up north in Boston that assists human-like robots called synths to escape their creators and captors at a place called the Institute. It is unclear if Father Clifford is a bishop or just a priest, and there is no mention of higher offices, so we don't know whether the Holy See survived the war intact, and if they did, whether or not they are even able to communicate with all the scattered adherents of the faith. Should Father Clifford die, Diego will assume the priestly functions of the church as the good father once did so that it may continue. The church seems quite popular among a segment of the Rivet Cityites. Riveters? Yeah, that one sounds the best. 8 residents will attend each Sunday, although one man, Bannon, will always leave partway through. There's always that one guy, isn't there? They are appreciative of Father Clifford and Diego, even if most of them think that the sermons can get a bit boring. And should the orphan Brian Wilkes be adopted by Vera Weatherly, who runs the Weatherly Hotel, he will also attend. With 32 total residents, that means a full quarter of them attend Mass each Sunday, which, interestingly, is right around the percentage of today's Catholic Church. So it could mean that where such churches can be found, average belief and attendance is actually similar. However, it must be pointed out that there are certainly differences between pre-war Catholicism and what is taught and practiced centuries later at Rivet City. The foremost example is the story of St. Monica herself, who has a totally different story in Fallout than the real St. Monica does in Catholic tradition. Although there are thematic parallels, in Fallout, St. Monica's life started out as a miracle, as she was the child conceived and born by 2 ghoul parents. Somehow, through this impossibility, she herself was not born as a ghoul, and she had a son herself, Aaron, who was also not a ghoul. Her lifetime of tragedies would begin when she was sold into slavery by raiders. Her son was taken away from her, and she was forced to sell herself to survive. St. Monica didn't lose faith though. She would preach the word of God to slaves and slavers alike and constantly pray for her son. Her faith was rewarded when one of the slavers that had heard her preaching for 16 years softened his heart and helped her escape. She spent years looking for her son, convinced that he was alive, but when she finally found him, it broke her heart. He had become a raider. Raised to be bloodthirsty and heartless, he had apparently overthrown his former slaver masters and took their place, ruling over raider and slave alike. He was so ruthless that as soon as he met his mom, he enslaved her, blaming her for his awful life circumstances. He would further punish his mom by giving her some sort of trial each day, but she never held it against him, telling him each day that she forgave him. Miraculously, she would be healed each morning of the prior day's violence, and over time, Aaron saw the wickedness of his ways and broke down one day, begging his mom for forgiveness. He resolved to completely turn away from his previous life, releasing his slaves and repenting to God. It is obvious that Fallout's St. Monica story has parallels to the real-world St. Monica, although the details are completely different. This altered story is likely a natural consequence of 2 centuries of changes and possibly adapting old stories for the new realities of the wasteland. Additionally, Father Clifford's staunch support of the railroad is because he believes that synths, or androids as he calls them, are God's children. This is certainly a departure from real-world Catholicism and Christianity in general, and would have very interesting theological connotations. This, combined with the lack of proper liturgical clothing and no outward symbols or artwork denoting Catholicism, indicate important differences. But I would like to mention something that could explain not only differences between pre-war and post-war Christianity, but even regional differences in doctrine and ritual as well. Scattered around the St. Monica Church and on the podium as well are books, which are only labeled as small ruined books. This is not a rare thing to see in churches as we explore, and it only makes sense that such books are religious in nature, whether they are scriptures or hymnals. Otherwise, they're just useless items taking up space in a small chapel. If these are indeed ruined, we may assume that parts of them are intact, Otherwise, they would serve absolutely no purpose, but being in a ruined state would imply that there is much that is missing. If the only scriptures surviving are wholly or partially destroyed, there could be gaps, so to speak, which would lead to differences because the basis of the faith, the scriptures, are not the same as they were before the war, and they may not even be the same from region to region. They are missing parts due to burning from the Great War or decaying in the 200 years since. The only other Christian group that is obviously quite close to real-world Christianity is very interesting and secretive. The existence of a place called the Abbey of the Road was revealed in Fallout 3's add-on Point Lookout when you encounter a missionary from this very abbey. Marcella is an eager and pious young woman who won't divulge in the location of the abbey except to record that it is west of Boston, an area known as the Commonwealth. Those that live at the abbey will be raised and grow up in this community, receiving a religious education until they receive the rites of mission, after which they are expected to roam the wastes to improve the state of the wasteland by doing good and spreading the word of the Bible. A missionary's secondary objective would be to recover and restore any religious relics for preservation, likely by bringing them back to the abbey. It is obvious that the Abbey of the Road is Catholic or descended from Catholicism, since they refer to themselves as an abbey, but also because Marcella can be heard saying the Hail Mary prayer in idle dialogue, and in a holotape where she is dying, she will begin to recite the act of contrition. Oh yeah, spoilers by the way, Marcella does not make it. Hope I didn't ruin that for you. Marcella is very well educated. She knows that the Bible and Christianity predates the Great War by hundreds of years, although she apparently doesn't travel with a Bible, relying instead on her exceptional knowledge and recalling scripture at will. This may mean that Bibles are too valuable to risk them being stolen from a roaming missionary. And it's also interesting that Marcella never refers to her faith as Christianity or Catholicism, rather just the faith, with a capital F. She and others from the Abbey also don't believe that the Great War was the end of the world like some others do, and rather just a great tragedy. Now there's an understatement. Her journey started by first traveling to the Commonwealth before catching a ride on a boat down to the capital wasteland. She was able to meet Father Clifford at Rivet City and break bread with him. She remarked how inspirational it was to see another believer of the faith, which certainly makes it sound like she doesn't encounter many on her travels. She ended up in Point Lookout, preaching to Tobar, the ferryman along the way, and learned a number of important things in her time here. The swamp folk are deadly and hyper-aggressive. The tribals that occupy the Ark and Dove Cathedral are not mindlessly aggressive, but they are closed to outsiders. She considered acting like she was interested in joining the tribals so that she could enter the cathedral and look for relics, but was morally against such dishonesty. Lastly, she met Obadiah Blackhall, an old, suspicious man living alone in a mansion, obsessed with recovering a special book that has gone missing. In the absence of willing listeners, Marcella has focused on doing good in the area by learning more about the suspicious old man and his book, which she learned is called the Krivbekni. She has actually heard mention of this book before and knows that it is an object of pure evil and must be destroyed, thereby fulfilling part of her mission. Although you, the lone wanderer, are on the quest to recover the book, a group of smugglers paid by Obadiah will find Marcella's camp and attack her, leaving her for dead. It is then up to us to decide if the book should be returned to Obadiah or destroyed, and somehow, Marcella knows exactly where to go and how to do that. We can't be certain how she knows about the evil building in the capital wasteland called the Dunwich Building, nor about the obelisk in the basement, but following her instructions to find this obelisk and press the book against its surface will certainly do something. The book will vanish in a burst of flame, destroyed, or taken elsewhere, but at least it is no longer able to be used to corrupt any longer. It is worth considering how Marcella has so much knowledge related to occult artifacts, what they are and how to destroy them, and I wonder if that is part of her training and education before becoming a missionary. It would be really interesting if this secretive abbey was training missionaries to spread the gospel, recover pre-war Christian relics, and hunt down and destroy occult artifacts, all while wearing Mad Max-style black leather outfits. Regardless, the faith that the abbey follows and preaches seems to be quite close to mainstream Christianity from the pre-war. In Fallout Tactics, there is only one overt reference to Christianity in the game, and the only depiction of Jesus in the series. In a church in Coldwater, there is a church led by Father Donald who is trying to give a sermon while completely drunk and instructing everyone on the sin of gambling. A sculpture of Jesus nailed to a cross is on the front of the podium, although there is not much else here of interest in this church that was built in the post-war. Interestingly, it seems Father Donald is hiding a little secret because in an area behind the altar is a stash of heavy weapons and armor. I guess you can't be too prepared out there in the wasteland. There are plenty of post-war religions and groups that may not be Christian themselves, but certainly seem to have derived some or much of their iconography, theology, or practices from Christianity, even perhaps my beloved Church of the Children of Adam. We can start with the most mundane, which we must go out west to find. The town of Modoc, which is only seen in Fallout 2, has a small chapel, seemingly made of adobe, most likely meaning it was a post-war construction, like many of the other buildings. It has pews and crosses on the wall, but it doesn't seem to have a priest or pastor, and is otherwise not worth much note other than this is where you, the chosen one, can get married. It isn't a religious ceremony, however. It is performed by the local sheriff and invokes frontier law. Modoc has fallen on hard times, and apparently no one attends the sermons anymore because they don't believe they have anything to be thankful for. At least Bessie here hasn't given up on her faith. Another chapel is in Nevada's second most sinful city, New Reno, known as the Drunk Cupid Chapel. The name is pretty revealing as it is run by Father Tully, a perpetually drunk priest. Yes, this again, the whiskey priest. Additionally, it is the only place someone can get a divorce from the marriage performed in Modoc, if you bribe Father Tully with alcohol, of course. Since he is apparently the only priest in the whole city, those that are religiously inclined will at least go through the effort of confessing some of their sins, which makes Father Tully a great resource of information and rumors, if you can bribe him with alcohol. The Drunk Cupid Chapel is at least based on Catholicism, although it has obviously deviated quite a bit and is more reminiscent of the drive-through wedding chapels that are associated with Las Vegas in our day. The Modoc Church does have Christian iconography, although the Drunk Cupid Chapel does not, with crosses adorning the walls, which is quite rare in Fallout. The mother of Fallout 3's main character, the Lone Wanderer herself, appears to have been a Christian and familiar with the Bible. One of the first things our Father James shows us as a toddler that can barely walk is a frame with the scripture written inside. This promise of giving unto those that are athirst of the waters of life was so inspirational to Catherine, our mom, that it guided her entire scientific pursuit, which became known as Project Purity, the first real attempt to clean the Capital Wasteland's irradiated water on a large scale. The pre-war town on the west coast called Searchlight shows up in Fallout New Vegas, and by the time the game takes place, the new California Republic had claimed the town and turned it into a base. It was sabotaged by their enemy, Caesar's Legion, and is now covered in a thick haze of radioactivity. The only two churches in the whole game are in this town, and one of them has a sign out front. Someone who knew their Bible well was able to reuse the existing letters to reference Revelations 9:6, which reads, "And in those days shall men seek death, and shall not find it, and shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them." This is such a great passage to describe what is happening at Camp Searchlight, since many of the NCR troopers ghoulified, some turning feral, cursed with near immortality by their condition. This message was most likely posted after the war and events at Searchlight because we can see the sign was salvaged for the right letters and numbers. In Fallout 4's main settlement called Diamond City, there is one active chapel. Although it is certainly not Christian, it has been influenced a bit nonetheless. The tiny All Faiths Chapel is led by Pastor Clements, who welcomes anyone and everyone to the chapel, which he encourages people to come and sit down and ponder the Almighty in whatever form they like, as long as it's peaceful. The pastor's unusual stance on religion is because he couldn't decide on one single god to dedicate the chapel to, so he decided it should belong to all of them. Hey, that's fine for me. I can just sit right here and hope no one's allergic to radiation around here. The Christian influence is there. The leader is a pastor, and he's wearing pastor's vestments. The building is referred to as a chapel, and the pastor can be heard mentioning the parable of the Good Samaritan when speaking of Nick Valentine, the local detective. Also, a fun fact, he will conduct a wedding between a man and a robot in an easy-to-miss side quest and figures that it's pretty weird, but he doesn't think God will mind. My very own religion, it seems, borrowed elements of Christianity during its formation. The Church of the Children of Adam uses some Christian titles like Confessor and Mother, and Confessor Cromwell, who leads the church in Fallout 3 settlement Megaton, will partially quote Revelations 1:7 when he says,
"Behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye shall be blind with his glory. Every ear shall be stricken deaf to hear the thunder of his voice."
Additionally, the Apostles of the Eternal Light, which is a sect of the Children of Adam, reference apostles and holy water in their name and practice. It is clear that the Children of Adam share more things in common with Christianity than any other pre-war religion. A strange, twisted cult that venerates the Mothman and even some other ancient and unknown entities has a strange habit of occasionally dressing in modified pastors' vestments and claiming pre-war churches as their own places for worship. The cult of the Mothman is rather diverse, with those that revere the holy red Mothman being immediately and unrepentantly aggressive. There are several churches in Appalachia where they have gone to the trouble of claiming the church and establishing a shrine. The church that fell into a sinkhole has a shrine and a sacrificial table and blade at the bottom. The entire town of Point Pleasant was taken over by cultists, but they were sure to build a large shrine in the former church. The Helvetia Church is another one with such a shrine, as is the Kanawha Cemetery Church, the one that had everyone die from mass poisoning, and they have completely claimed the church and graveyard and started to change the chapel drastically to offer a perch for their holy Mothman. What draws cultists to these churches? Since this is only 25 years after the Great War, perhaps they just naturally associate churches with a holy place as they did prior to the war and decide to claim it for their newfound religion. Or perhaps there is something more to these locations, some sort of supernatural presence or draw that brings ghouls and cultists alike together in these places. The Children of the Cathedral were a post-war cult that worshipped some dark god in the first Fallout before they were convinced to join the game's antagonist, the Master, and his cause. They are the public-facing part of the Master's plan, gathering intel and inducting people into the cryptic cult, but they are using a pre-war cathedral as their main base, which they seem to have duded up a little bit, and it serves as the entrance to the underground facility where the Master resides. They will also use pre-war Christian terminology like baptism, although they don't appear to conduct actual baptisms. Finally, possibly the most Christian from a moral standpoint of all these post-war influence groups is the Followers of the Apocalypse, first seen in the first Fallout, but popping up again in Fallout New Vegas. As their symbol, they have adopted a stylized cross and are dedicated to helping any waster, particularly those suffering from medical or addiction problems. One prominent member, Arcade Gannon, is very well read, like most members are, and he can paraphrase at least 2 scriptures and can recite one of them in Latin, although this appears to be due to how well read he is rather than an indication of his religion. However, it is important to point out that they are strictly secular and non-religious, at least in their mission. Aside from the new large groups, factions, or religions that contain some Christian influences, there are a number of instances of one-off Christian-related Easter eggs throughout the series. The largest graveyard in Fallout 2 is just south of New Reno and consists of many graves, often with jokes and quips etched on the gravestones, and large spikes where people are run through and left to die in the sun. So far, not that Christian. However, the graveyard was established at a crossroads which conveniently make the shape of a large cross. And the graveyard is also called Golgotha, a biblical name meaning the place of the skull, which is believed to be the place where Jesus was crucified. Another biblical name is used by one of the casinos on the Strip, the one more focused on adult entertainment, called Gomorrah. Those that named it definitely knew what they were doing, considering the services that they offer, as Gomorrah and Sodom were 2 Old Testament cities that were known for their sexual deviance. A small cult in Fallout 4 called the Pillars of the Community is led by a charismatic character that will try to convince you to give him every single thing you own. And interestingly, the name of this character will change playthrough to playthrough. The list of possible names are some of the names of Jesus' apostles, like Thomas, Andrew, Matthew, James, and Simon, although there is no further connection between this group and Christianity. A character in Fallout 3 that is associated with the contract killer perk is Daniel Littlehorn, a mysterious man sitting in a small shack within the scrapyard with some secretaries just typing away. He will be the one to reward the Lone Wanderer for killing good karma characters and bringing their ear as proof. His name is a reference to the Book of Daniel, specifically chapter 8, where something called the Little Horn symbolized what is interpreted as either Satan or the Antichrist, which is fitting for such a dispassionately evil man who is just interested in making the wasteland a worse place. Some NPCs will quote or summarize common scriptures as well, showing that there is either some familiarity or that these sayings were so culturally ingrained that they just continue to be passed on. The head of the slavers, located in the Den in Fallout 2, will quote Job 28:18 by saying, "The price of wisdom is above rubies." John Cassidy, a possible companion in Fallout 2, will actually mention the Good Book, and when asked about the quest item called the Garden of Eden Creation Kit, will remark that he didn't know the Garden of Eden came in a kit. Cassidy is a good guy, and given his mentions of the Good Book, there is a chance he is a practicing Christian. Ulysses, a protagonist of New Vegas's final DLC, among his copious amount of dialogue, he will compare you, the courier, to Judas Iscariot, the apostle of ill repute that betrayed Jesus. He will only say this if we make it clear we are aligned with Mr. House rather than any of the other factions, and he gets a little jab at us by saying that we did it for, quote, 29 less coins, meaning that we are doing something terrible for even less than Judas accepted to betray Jesus. There are also some meta references, like an early quest in Fallout 3 called 300 Pieces of Silver that has us shaking down a woman called Silver for an old debt, a quest in New Vegas called Render unto Caesar, which is from Matthew 22:21, and in the red-headed stepchild of the series, Fallout Brotherhood of Steel, the leader of the mutant army named Addis will quote a modified form of Revelation 13:7 that speaks of the beast making war against the saints. Christianity had a profound effect on pre-war America, and although it has greatly diminished since the bombs dropped, either due to the loss of knowledge when much of the population was wiped out, and then a gradual degradation over time, or because a majority of believers abandoned their faith in the face of unspeakable adversity. That effect continues in the post-war, and we will continue to seek groups and religions inspired by Christianity, as well as more Christian groups and churches making sense of their destroyed world. Thank you for being with me today to hear the word of Adam. I would love to hear your thoughts regarding the state of Christianity in Fallout. Were there any interesting references that I missed? If you enjoyed this and like what I do, support in whatever way you fancy. And if you want to go above and beyond and join Adam's holy army, you can do so on Patreon or YouTube like these fine people here. I want to extend a radioactive welcome to the KingKong.gaming and John Call on YouTube, and Simon Taylor, Rena Hart, and Old Almond Milk, gross, on Patreon. Adam, bless. I have plans to revamp supporter rewards and will be holding a vote soon for the next supporter video, so now is a great time to join. As always, a special thank you to my top tier supporters, Acrid B, Gardner Minshew Simp, Dominic White, Tapey Papey, The Breadman, Tyler Eaton, Owen Balzer, Ann94, The Love Mummy, Shallowfire 13, Phantom Inc., Tater Anus, and Ibis the Owl. Adam is pleased. Take care of yourselves. Within you resides billions of universes. Walk in Adam's holy glow, and I'll see you soon.